So he said. But he must have realized, because he did not try to deceive himself, that he had broken the Mongol law as much as the 60 officers he was condemning. He'd merely had the greater force to prevail over them. The Noyans made no answer to him. One turned to the others, saying, "My companions, at the time we raised Arik Buka to the throne, we swore to die for him at need. Now that time has come. They were beaten or strangled to death. Kubilai had enforced his claim to the Khanate. Yet, outside of his own followers and the Chinese, he had no one of the Golden family he could trust. Many of the steppe chieftains came in to make submission to him. Hulagu from Syria sent his recognition, and Birkai, to appease the new Khakan, sent congratulatory gifts. But Kubilai understood that he must rule alone, and he took a step that he must have weighed for a long time. It followed the path of his own inclination, and it changed the nature of the Mongol Empire. He did not return to Karakorum. With his court, he took the whole of his ordo back to China. He turned back on the graves of his ancestors in the valley of the Mountain of Power, and at his departure the grey mud walls of Karakorum became almost deserted. Wiser than the elder Mongols, Kubilai understood that the desert city had outlived its purpose. It had served only as a meeting place for the Golden family, a walled enclosure in the high prairies that came to be the nomad's warehouse for the loot of the outer world. Now with the Golden family divided, Kubilai, as Khakan, expected to gain his revenues from China alone. And he, steeped in Chinese culture, could not carry on the administration of Cathay from the prairies. Instead, he moved his court to Yen King within the Great Wall. And this removal snapped the tie that bound his Mongols to their homeland. After that, they ceased to be steppe dwellers. Even in the spirit, Kubilai had faced them, for better or worse, toward the farther east. And again, this decision was not entirely of his own making. He was only adapting himself to the circumstances created by the genius of Yaliu Chutsai and the tranquil persistence of Yao Chao, the irreconcilables. Another force pushed Kublai Khan eastward. In the ranges of mid-Asia, the survivors of the House of Ogadai had taken refuge, joining themselves there to the descendants of the wild horse, Chagatai, who still followed the ancestral way of life in the highlands remote from any direct contact with what so-called civilization. They found a man to lead them who was pure Mongol, Kaidu, Ogadai's grandson, the hero of the victories in Europe. Kaidu was as much a master of war as Kubilai, his uncle. He had, moreover, a blood feud with the house of Tului. The elder Mongol saw in him the likeness of another Genghis Khan, a hard soul indifferent to religion, determined to lead the steppe dwellers to war. When Kubilai sent to him to ask why he did not come to submit, he answered laconically with the traditional excuse of the family: "My horses are sick." When Arik Buka went to Kubilai, the Khakan, Rashid explains, Kaidu was seized with fear of Kubilai, and he turned from the Yasa, and became a rebel. Because of that, many a Mongol and Muslim has gone to his death. At first, Kaidu was master of a few men, but he was clever and full of deceit and equal to any need. He got together 2,000 or 3,000 men and set about making friends with the house of Juchi until he was able to gather aid from every quarter. Kaidu ranged from the forested Altai to the heights of Afghanistan, levying tribute on the 5 cities, allowing the Turk, who was Yelbadj's son, to administer these crossroad centers of sedentary people, while he raided Samarkand and Bokhara. He maintained no elaborate court. He welcomed the rebellious Mongol Noyons as Endas, companions in war. And could that somehow link to the Andras of the Goetia? Is that number 63? And he waged war against Kubilai in the Mongol fashion, making surprise attacks when his horses were well fed and fit. Kubilai, on his part, was forced to stand on the defensive, as the Chinese emperors had defended themselves against the nomads. Kubilai threw a screen of mobile cavalry units along his new frontier, the edge of the Gobi, and the mid-region of the northern prairies. When Kaidu's attacks broke through this screen, the field army of the Khakan would move against the invader, driving him back. The Khakan could not pursue the rebels beyond the wastes of the Gobi, nor could he ever feel himself safe from surprise in northern China. Kaidu, like Kubilai, had the gift of inspiring loyalty. His followers were the descendants of the great Turkish clans, only gradually yielding to the influence of Islam, and he had a daughter so devoted to him that she refused a mate of her own. Like her father, she chose to spend her life in the saddle, and her skill in warfare became a tradition among the nomads who followed Kaidu. Even the matter-of-fact Marco Polo, who ventured across Kaidu's dominion at that time, had a word to say of her. Her name is Ai Yaruk, which is to say, the bright moon. This damsel was very fair, but also strong in feats of skill, and ye must know that her father never went away to war, but she went with him. And gladly he took her. At times she would leave her father's side and make a dash at some enemy as deftly as a hawk pouncing on a bird. Rashid had a clear impression of this daughter. She went about like a boy with the army, and her father honored her, although her brothers cried out against her, saying, "Your work is with sewing, knife and needle. What have you to do with our ruling and our following?" When they said that, she was angered. Her father honored her. He would give her to no man. And people slandered him, saying that he surely was in love with his own daughter. After many years, Kaidu felt shame of the mockery of his people and gave her to wife to a man of Cathay. It is known that this bright moon made her father's cause her own. Legend relates that Ai Yaruk took tribute of horses from would-be husbands, but refused to give up her army life for any man. Her courage gave a romantic hue to Kaidu's indomitable revolt. And between them, they had the grazing lands of mid-Asia for nearly 40 years. Well, kind of sounds like anti-romantic, right? Everything comes before love, between people. This campaign of the irreconcilables had consequences that grew decisive with time. Since the area of Kaidu's raids covered both main caravan routes across the continent, the traffic between east and west was interrupted. The ancient Silk Route especially was becoming hazardous, and since communication between the new empires of the Ilkhans and the Golden Horde and Yen King had almost ceased, the Mongol conquerors in the west felt themselves free to act independently of the authority of the Khakan and Yen King. The Mongol Empire was dismembering swiftly into its four quarters, and the homelands had ceased to have any significance. Xanadu. When Kaidu rode with his herds, his bagpipes, and minstrels beyond the Gobi's sands, Kubilai felt free to rule at last as he wished. He entered Cathay not as a frontiersman Mongol come to squeeze the land, but as a well-wisher, a benevolent conqueror intent on founding a dynasty of his own. The Sechem had seen the defects of Mongol supremacy. Well, a conqueror that wants his own dynasty is not exactly the same thing as a benevolent conqueror. He had cast his lot with the Chinese, and first the Mongols to do so, he understood them. He understood them too well to trust them. Much as he admired their culture, he did not mean to yield to this persuasive culture as the Yin had done before him. With all a nomad's great personal pride, he felt that he could rule as a Mongol over the Chinese. It was a daring ambition to try to dispense with the evils of the Chinese system and the failings of the simple Mongol autocracy, to find a happy medium of his own. But Kubilai had great courage and stubbornness, as well as a Mongol's natural instinct for statesmanship. His new residents of Shangtu, the Xanadu of Coleridge's laudanum dream, hard liquor with opium, began to take strange shape. Within a palisade 16 miles, and circuit parks grew beside lakes that were man-made, trees, which were Kubilai's pet obsession. After his early life in the dust-driven prairies began to rise by the lakes, he rode through the Shangtu Park to watch his hawks in mew, and at times he carried a hunting leopard behind his saddle, losing the leopard at any animal that took his fancy. Xandu was really a huge game preserve. Satisfied with shade and running water, the Mongol who was designing the structure of an empire planned a new kind of palace. It stood in the wood of Shangtu, built of canes, gilded and roped together with silk cords so that it could be taken down and moved elsewhere at his pleasure. He spent most of his time at first in a pavilion of leopard skins, but the skins were lined with ermine. Not content with that, Kubilai ordered a marble court to be raised by the lake, the marble to be gilded and painted with forms of hunters, birds, and beasts, and trees. He did not feel at ease in a Chinese yamen. That was like a prison. Yet to please his Chinese counselors, he decreed the building of a temple to Confucius beside the marble court, and before then he erected elsewhere at the suggestion of the Chinese mandarins a strange structure, a place for his dead ancestors. In this place, called by the Chinese Tai Miao, he placed tablets for each of the golden family, for Yasukai, Genghis Khan, Ogadai, the bastard Juchi, Chagatai, Tului, his father, Kuyuk, and Mangu. Upon these he bestowed honorific names in Chinese, with the exception of Juchi and Chagatai, who were not Kubilai's direct ancestors, and who had not reigned. Before these name tablets, incense was burned, and Kubilai came at intervals to bow before the distinguished dead, who would have been vastly surprised in their lifetime to contemplate such ceremonial. Kubilai was neither the first nor the last self-made man to sublimate his ancestors, and he gave a name to the dynasty he meant to found. It was to be the Yuan, the Outland. Straightway he commissioned a group of Hanlin scholars to write the history of the Yuan dynasty, and it seemed fitting to order an astronomer, Jamal ad-Din, to make a new calendar to inaugurate his reign, and to increase the skill of his scientists. He ordered the casting of new bronze instruments for the astrologer's tower, a globe of the sky, an armillary sphere, a gnomon. This tax kept his 7 chosen scientists occupied for years, because Kubilai was ever hungry of omens that had a mathematical basis. Well, the thing about astrology is it can be directed towards whatever symbolism you can connect to it, really. It's not that the patterns are ruling anybody in that way. Different cultures, different interpretations, and if the calculations are wrong, it doesn't affect the outcome of the symbolism, or it typically won't. That tells you something. It was a great convenience to know the fortunate moons and lucky days, and also the hours when the star of evil omen was ascendant. He made a habit of pitting the Chinese against the Muslimin in such endeavors, being much too shrewd to trust one of the many peoples subject to him. To translate works that he wished to read, he gathered a coterie of Uyghurs, Persians, Tibetans, and Turks of the Bokhara academies at his court. He had an insatiable curiosity, and he was avid of the wisdom gleaned from books. Being a Mongol, he could be deceived, but it was most dangerous to attempt to deceive him. In fact, he established what amounted to a clearinghouse of the scientific knowledge of that time. He discovered that strangers who joined his court could be trusted to serve him, and he made a practice of rewarding them greatly. At the same time, he was pitiless if imposed upon. Once listening to a reading from the Quran, he discovered that it laid a command upon Muslimin to kill unbelievers. Summoning the chief mullah to him, Kubilai asks if this were so. The teacher of Islam admitted it. They weren't killed for being unbelievers. Islam does not command people to kill people for being unbelievers. And you believe that this Quran has been given to you by God? Kubilai demanded. The mullah assented. Then why do you not obey its command and slay those who do not believe as you do? Because the time has not come, and because we are unable to do it yet. Yeah, any of these passages in context, none of the 165 jihad verses, as they call it, say that people believe different, so you must kill them, or they're apostates, so you must hurt them, or blasphemers, or disbelievers. It doesn't say that. None of the 43 expeditions were wars to force conversion, or merely because people had a different religion or something. But I am able to do it, Kubilai assured him. In order the execution of the mullah, a terrible persecution of Muslimin followed through Gathay until a sage of Bokhara was able to convince Kubilai that a Mongol like himself could not in any sense of the word be an unbeliever, because he put the name of God at the head of all its utterances. Kubilai shocked the ritual-minded Marco Polo by the freedom of his reasoning. There are 4 prophets, he declared, to whom people pray and give reverence on earth: Jesus Christ, Muhammad, Moses, and Sakyamuni. I bow to all of them, and also before him who of them all is the most great in the sky. I pray him to give me aid. Why should then I make myself a Christian? You see well that the Christians in this land are ignorant, while the servants of the so-called pagan gods can do anything they desire. Well, for a lot of Christians, it's, particularly nowadays, that's closer to the thing. If people are Christian and they say, well, I'm Christian, it's not so much what I do, it's what I say I believe. But, of course, Islam and most forms of Judaism do not allow the worshiping of the prophets. And he gave Messer Marco a demonstration of the miracle working of the Tibetan lamas, who managed to move a goblet filled with wine through the air into Kubilai's waiting hand. They can conjure up storms, the Khan added, and direct them to where they please. They can speak to their so-called pagan gods. Now, pagan and heathen from the Latin and Greek roots has nothing to do with religious differences. It's material culture. And you find that among those peoples, the same things were worshipped by the city dwellers and the people in huts and whatnot, and often the frontier. To such a Red Lama out of Tibet, Kubilai gave the spiritual headship of his domain. However much Kubilai really believed in the tantric rituals of the shamanists, he seemed to have a strong liking for this Lama. Phagspa, from the long white mountain, to Phagspa he gave the title of the king of the great and precious law and creator of the empire. He put Phagspa to useful work, requesting him and his wisdom to devise a universal alphabet in which the spoken Mongolian could be combined with the written Chinese and Tibetan. This to relieve the plague of tongues and scripts at the Mongol court. Not even a Dalai Lama could devise one script to satisfy all tongues, although Phagspa made a brave attempt. This authority, enjoined by Tibetan, offended the Chinese intellectuals who were Taoist in imagination and Confucianist in scholarship. Perhaps that did not displease Kubilai, who was attempting to build a world state upon the foundation of China. He was struggling against the very culture he most admired, for in the placidity and ritualism of Chinese life he observed a force that could not be broken by weapons. In his system of government, shrewdly devised to extend to all classes of his subjects, he gave no race a controlling hand. His native Mongols held the commanding positions in the army, and over the Darugashis, the judges, provincial commands, and heads of department, the more subtle Muslimin were appointed to the secondary authority and served also as financial agents. The Chinese controlled the schools and the heads of corporations. So, in rough outline, Kubilai kept the police power in the hands of the Mongols, the treasury under the aegis of the foreigners, and the education under the Chinese. Each race under this plan could do the work it was best fitted for. Well, more like cultural training, and each would act as a balance to the others, for Kubilai intended to bring about no less a thing than administration of peace that should eliminate all suffering among the lower classes of his people. Well, unnecessary hardship, you could say, but suffering is a choice. Suffering is different than mere physical difficulties, right? To do this, it was necessary for him first to conquer the south of China, where the Sung dynasty reigned, convinced by Yao Chao and his Chinese advisors that the Mongol plan of conquest was too bloody, resulting in obliteration of manpower and in rebellion. He set about this task in a manner of his own. The campaign against the Sung, he argued, should be waged without slaughter. Cities, he told his commanders, could be taken more easily by humanity than by pyramids of dead bodies. In the end, this new method of conquest was carried out as Kubilai wished, but it took 12 years, the fall of the Sung. The heart of China beat below the Yangtze's swift waters, and this heart was formed of human multitudes. Frontiersmen had raided and ruled the north, Cathay, since the early dynasties, but the south had remained untouched by invasion. It had isolated itself from migration and world conflict, and to that extent it had stagnated. The blood of the heart was thinned, pulsed slowly. The rulers of the Sung had memories of 18 dynasties. Their own society had endured for 3 centuries, and the eyes of that society had turned inward to the contemplation of spiritual values, to appreciation of a painter's brush strokes, and the delicacy of lines that suggested lakes in twilight. Increasing melancholy touched the spirits of the Sung. They had made for themselves an earthly paradise among the southern mountains, a paradise where the foliage of trees turned an autumn red, and an old moon hung over drowsy villages. Upon a terrace in a motionless land, the poet Sung Po-jen wrote, "In the evening sky, to watch the rain clouds passing across the sky. All the light swallows are carried away by a distant wind." To such a feeding upon the inward spirit had their long isolation reduced the Sung in their thoughts. The advance of the Mongols beyond the frontier was no more than another raid of the horse nomads from the steppes. During these centuries, The Sung Empire had perfected an economy of peace in which the agriculture of the countryside supported the gigantic centers of city life. In turn, the trade of the cities sustained the workers of the soil, but it was a fragile economy, breeding the extremes of wealth and poverty. The members of the imperial family, close to the Son of Heaven, were remote as the clouds of the poet's sky from the fishermen of the Yangtze gorges. The strength of the Song lay in these immense walled cities. Lin Gan itself, enclosed in 1,600,000 families, it was a metropolis built of a dozen city centers. Vasaf the chronicler says that it had 64 public squares and 700 temples walled like fortresses. Its river was intercut with canals over which the population moved on 360 bridges. Marco Polo, with his love for mighty figures, says 12,000. Some of stone, so huge that ocean-going junks could pass under them. Paved with brick and stone, the streets were drained into the canals. Each street had a fireproof tower in which grain could be stored. Each house, ornamented with paintings, had its inhabitants listed on a tablet hanging by the door. Police guarded the barriers of the different quarters, under command of the great quieter, serving also as a fireman at need. And Lin Nagan was shaped for the enjoyment of life, with its central community park, its lake surrounded by the palace and temple districts where gondolas and pleasure barges gave greater quiet than the streets. In this, we recognize the outline of a modern metropolis without skyscrapers or a factory district. It even had an outer, encircling boulevard. Chariots could drive around the summit of the vast city wall. Toward Lin Nagan, the armies of Kubilai advanced in their new method of attack, avoiding bloodshed. Fortunately for Kubilai, he had commanders who were men of genius. Achu, a grandson of Subutai, had the sagacity of the elder Mongols, while Bayan, the gifted, had nothing less than genius for arriving at his ends. In fact, the war after the first years became less Kubilai's than Bayan's, for Kubilai did not lead this invasion in person. The Mongol commanders, as it happened, had a just grievance against the Sung because the Sung minister had taken advantage of the truce hastily agreed upon by Kubilai when he marched back to Karakorum to deal with Arikbuka. This minister represented the truce within his frontiers as a victory gained against the Mongols in the field, and never enlightened the imperial family of the Sung as to the terms they were obliged to carry out. He had profited further by the Mongol civil war to liquidate the Mongol frontier detachments, and so to claim new victories. The people at home believed the Mongols had been defeated, and when envoys were sent from Kubilai's court to protest other Mongol officials, he imprisoned, preventing any word of the actual situation from reaching Lin Nagan. But he found himself unable to cope with the new Mongol armies of attack supposedly defeated long since, and his treachery caused several of the ablest commanders of the Sung to desert to the more reasonable Mongols. So Bayan presently had under his command not only contingents of the North China engineers and crossbowmen, but some of the best units of the Sung frontier infantry. He advanced by methodical stages, besieging a city only when necessary, although he could not escape costly battles, and at times he would enter a captured town to find the wells choked with the bodies of the Sung families that had committed suicide. He spread before his advance a propaganda of pacification instead of the customary Mongol terrorism. He took pains to go himself to make public prayer by the bodies of Sung commanders who had killed themselves after a defeat. This gesture of respect earned the appreciation of the Sung people. A lot of cultures, they will not, pray over the suicides. Passing through a plague-ridden countryside, Bayan sent physicians from his command into the affected villages. Some of his regiments carried plows and hoes to help the field workers of the countryside to get their crops sown. Nor did he yield to the diplomatic trickery of the Sung ministry. Envoys were sent from Lin Nagan to his camp to protest against the invasion of a country which was then ruled by a boy emperor and his mother, the Empress Dowager. Your master is young, you say, Kubilai's Generalissimo replied. But you have forgotten that the emperor of the Chu, from whom your founder wrestled the empire, was also a child. Do you find it strange that we do likewise to you? A deft answer like this was making the Sung envoys lose face, not for the first time, weighed more with the Chinese spirit than a victory in the field. Not that Chu and Bayan abandoned military expedients. They called for experts in the manufacture of siege engines from Abaka. The Ilkhan of Persia and these Muslim engineers were able to construct gonels, the heavy artillery of the day, casting stones so large that they shattered any defensive wall and crushed buildings within the cities. Chu even devised a navy, and the Mongols were always reluctant to enter boats on the lower Yangtze. He manned a chain of boats with Chinese crossbowmen, and when he was attacked from leeward by a Sung flotilla, he opened fire with flaming darts from the crossbows that started a conflagration in the attacking junks. The fire carried down the wind, breaking up the flotilla. Another account has it that the fire was started by inflammables shot from ballista. When the grandmother of the 7-year-old emperor set letters broadcast through the lands of the Sung, urging the feudal nobility to join in the defense of the capital, Lin Nagan Bayan dispatched his officers over the countryside with sacks of coins to be distributed where the campaign had impoverished the towns. On his approach to the immense walls of the Lin Nagan, he gave orders prohibiting Mongol soldiers from stealing any property or requisitioning food. No armies of field workers could be assembled to resist such an advance. Some of the devoted Sung commanders committed suicide, and Bayan gave them solemn burial with benefit of ritual. The war, in fact, was won. While the banners of the Mongol advance reached the river of Lin Nagan, Bayan halted, spreading his encampment along the horizon, facing centuries-old ramparts. The Dowager the Dowager Empress, realizing more clearly that her ministers and commanders said resistance was useless, sent a request to Bayan to come into her presence. Wisely, he excused himself, saying that he was ignorant of the proper ceremonial to be employed in approaching a presence of such distinction.